Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the war in Syria after a day of deadly airstrikes on Aleppo. Is there any hope of reviving the recent ceasefire brokered by the United States and Russia? Joining me now via Skype from London is Ammar Waqqaf. He is the founder of Gnosos, an organization that offers opinion on Syria and the Middle East. Also with us from Providence, Rhode Island, is Vladimir Golstein. He is an associate professor of Slavic studies at Brown University. And with me here in the studio is Gartenstein-Ross. He has served as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome to all of you to the show. Let's go to London and start with Ammar. We just heard from the UN Special Envoy there, Staffan de Mistura. He is hopeful that the ceasefire can be restored, and once restored, he's hopeful that aid can get through to those people who need it. Are you optimistic, given the fact that, just shortly after the ceasefire was announced, we had a UN aid convoy that was bombed. We also had government forces now attacking Aleppo?
Well, good evening. Our estimate of the situation is that the United States has made a strategic shift. It's not a complete turnaround, but it's a strategic shift nonetheless, in trying to preserve certain fighting groups by ditching the Jabhat al-Nusra. And that, is a good basis for a long-term agreement. And whether this specific ceasefire holds or not, the way things are going seems that they will come to an agreement later on. Probably what is happening at the moment is that the Syrian state and its Russian ally are telling the United States that they always have the alternative should an agreement not be fully implemented, or somebody doesn't like it or whatever, that they can go back to their old military tactic and strategy and strike hard at the rebels, which is the United States doesn't want, because at the end of the day they do not want a disintegration into in the rebel ranks. So at the end of the day, we think that whether in the coming week or even months it doesn't hold, then at least we've gone we've put our foot on the right step, on the right road. Sorry.
Vladimir, the Russians brokered the ceasefire with the Americans. What can Russia now do to make sure that that ceasefire is resuscitated in some way?
I don't think Russians are particularly optimistic at that moment. They, in fact, Lavrov and many others among Russian leadership said, as far as they're concerned, all these negotiations are over. And there is a clear reasons for that. Russians were very, they worked very hard in negotiating. Their partners, Syrian government, kept their side of the bargain. And then what we have is this allied forces, United States, Australia, Denmark, bombing Syrian forces in Deir el-Zor, killing almost 65 people, and then throwing some kind of hissy fit saying that, Russians don't have a right to complain about it. But if you think about it, what kind of a message it sends to the Syrian people, that the United States bombed the Syrian army, obviously in support of the enemies of the government. In other words, it's in support of terrorists who keep on fighting and attacking and bombing. Maybe it was a mistake, but the very quick reaction, almost happy response to that coming from Pentagon is not encouraging. Two leaders from Pentagon, Ashton Carter and General Joseph Dunford, were today or yesterday giving a testimony to the Senate, and they were saying, no, all negotiations are over. As far as we're concerned, we need more money. Our partners in the military business community need more money. So it's clear that the United States are not particularly interested in any peaceful negotiations. Okay. Pentagon working their angle, and so that's a very pessimistic. I view it. Until the elections, there is cannot be no positive talk about that.
All right, David, that U.S. attack on the Syrian position, do you believe that that was the reason the ceasefire broke down?
No, absolutely not. The ceasefire was, never respected in the first place. I mean, fighting went on in the ground. There was a small cessation in fighting, and it seems to me that the reason for the cessation was much more the Eid al-Adha. holiday rather than actually the fact that the ceasefire was making a difference on the ground. So number one, the fighting had continued. Number two, I think it is abundantly clear that the U.S. did in fact bomb accidentally, that was not an intentional bombing. I think it is irresponsible to suggest otherwise. I've been a huge critic of U.S. policy in Syria. I think U.S. policy is criminally negligent. But it did not bomb Deir ez-Zor to allow ISIS to advance, which is what happened after the bombing occurred. I think that this will be vetted. I don't understand how a mistake like that happened. But it's very clear looking at lines into the Pentagon that they didn't intend to do this. They certainly wouldn't intend to do so. The final thing is that with respect to a ceasefire like this, I do think a ceasefire is important. But I think one of the problems is the assumption that the U.S. has enough control over rebel factions to broker a ceasefire on their behalf.
Well, it's a point we brought up with Staffan de Mistura, that there is no enforcement mechanism of any kind here.
Well, moreover, the U.S., given its rather incoherent policy in Syria and the fact that it is only a minor player compared to countries like Qatar or Turkey or Saudi Arabia, I don't think the U.S. actually has the ability to go in and broker a ceasefire on the part of local rebel groups. I think it has to be brokered by those groups themselves and not the U.S. acting as their proxy, because I don't think the U.S. has that kind of control. This isn't the Cold War when the great powers dictated facts on the ground for their proxies. It's a very different situation where the U.S. is more marginal and Russia is much more central than the U.S. is.
Right, and Ammar, what are the chances of those opposition forces on the ground signing off on any kind of ceasefire? I mean, the war is now in its 6th year, and the Syrian government is already saying that its intention is to recover every last inch of land that it has lost, territory that it has lost to the rebels.
All right, I lost sound, so I'm going to start. Well, first of all, allow me to be a little bit irresponsible. I've just heard the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov quote an army spokesman on the Voice of America saying that they've actually acquired intelligence on the target that they bombed in Deir ez-Zor for about 2 days. And in 2 days, you know exactly who you are bombing. I don't think at all, and there is a strong argument that it was not unintentional at all. Probably the United States was telling Russia to stop pushing towards announcing the agreement, or that they can actually, if the agreement doesn't go ahead, that they can actually turn or upset the apple cart or whatever. Going back to your question, the difference between, and Mr. de Mistura touched on the February cessation of hostilities. There is a bit of a difference. At the time, well, the main theme still with regards to the armed groups is called Jabhat al-Nusra and their position vis-a-vis the other groups. Now, at the time, they issued a warning, a severe warning to the other groups, saying that if you go on with this and participate in the political solution, i.e. if you jump at the wagon, basically we will swallow you, we will convince your elements and members to defect, and so on and so forth. Now, Jabhat al-Nusra are changing tactic. They are saying, oh, we're going to integrate with you and we're going to rewrite, the battalions and reform everything. And the key issue here is that the likes, for example, of Saudi Arabia, probably Turkey as well, and Qatar, are arguing that if Jabhat al-Nusra is singled out, whilst it's actually the main striking force against the government forces in Syria, then that would severely hamper the rebels' fighting power, and that, at the end of the day,
right,
would make the government win. So this is the kind of dichotomy that we're in at the moment. The United States feels that it is important to ditch Jabhat al-Nusra to save the others, whilst the regional powers are saying, well, if we ditch Jabhat al-Nusra, then the government forces are going to win. So it's just a matter of trust, really.
Right, David, do you want to say something?
I mean, just the U.S.'s policy was never to support Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a designated terrorist group. I understand what the guest is saying, in that the moderate rebel groups who the U.S. supported did work with Nusra, which makes the U.S. policy all the more incoherent. But I just do want to point out that U.S. policy was never to support Nusra.
Vladimir, what kind of leverage or influence does Russia have over Bashar al-Assad right now?
I think Russia, was invited, the only country which was invited by a Syrian president to help. And when Lavrov negotiated with Kerry some kind of a peace, understanding was United States also want to help to have peace. But now, Russia has, a lot of leverage with Assad, but after their ally, Assad forces were bombed, intentionally or not, it doesn't really matter. I'm quite surprised what Americans bombers were doing in this area to begin with, if they were so much interested in keeping the peace. But they're obviously not interested in keeping the peace. So I think, Russia has the only one way to go is probably to help Syrians to take over Aleppo and then negotiate from the position of strength. Because otherwise, when they negotiate from the position of goodwill, as the position which the Mistura argued, which is a wonderful position of goodwill and taking care of Syrian people, but it's not happening. If other forces, opponents of the peace, are being encouraged, voluntarily or not, being encouraged to keep on fighting, then it's no clear solution. So Russia and we see this. Russia is doing it. They start helping Syrians to bomb Aleppo until sort of the other side realizes that they have to negotiate, seriously negotiate.
Okay, David, how invested is the US in finding a peaceful solution here? Syria was barely mentioned in the president's speech at the United Nations General Assembly. What are the options now for the US?
That's a good question. I agree with what Ammar had said at the outset, that there's a shift in U.S. policies, but it hasn't been a reversal. Look, if you look at what the U.S.'s policies have been, they're all over the map, right? At times...
Is the U.S. still insisting that Bashar al-Assad has to go?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
I believe so. But the ceasefire would preserve Assad's position.
Right.
So it seems that there's a shift, but not actually a reversal in policy, which makes the U.S. position incoherent. I think that, look, I disagree with a lot of things the other guests said, as is quite obvious. Mm-hmm. But one thing that makes U.S. policies so suspect worldwide is that nobody understands, including, I think, within many layers of the government, what U.S. policy actually is. The administration has never clarified it. At times, Kerry has compared Assad to Hitler. Other times, he suggests that Assad could stay. It's completely all over the map, inconsistent, incoherent.
Right, Ammar, I've only got 20 seconds. What is going to happen next?
Well, I think the Syrian state and its Russian ally, as Vladimir said, that they are going to prove that they can always revert back to a military position where they have, where they can actually incorporate dominant resources.
Right.
And that would put them into a very good negotiating position.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us.